Good evening. My name is Joshua, and the story I'm about to tell is from my late grandfather, Mr. Ignacio. Right up until a little while before he passed away, he would recount it to us in detail and would always warn us not to trust friendships too easily. To make it clearer, I'll tell it as if it were him, back in the time when everything happened, at the end of the 1940s. Things were pretty behind back then. We didn't have TV to watch the news or even a radio. I lived in the rural part of a town in Georgia, and we only heard any news when we went into town. The shopkeepers would buy newspapers that brought news directly from the capital. We'd gather in their stores or small bars and listen to the shop owner reading the news out loud, because, like me, most people there were illiterate. Usually, the news was about the country's economy. One time I was heading back to town, and along the way I ran into an acquaintance of my father's. He was coming back from town and stopped me, saying, "Ignacio, something really strange is happening around here." I was at Ken's store and heard people talking about an animal attacking folks' livestock. The animal seems big because it's dragging off even calves. People are missing their dogs and cats too. I'm going to reinforce my pig pen and chicken coop because I don't have much to lose. You'd better tell your father to do the same, or he'll face a loss. I thanked him for the warning and went on my way. When I got to town, I did the shopping my mother had asked for, then went to a bar to have a shot of whiskey. Some men there were furious, saying that their livestock simply disappeared. This animal left nothing but a blood trail, which ended at the edge of the forest. The creature was silent and cautious since nobody heard anything at night, but by morning, the damage was done. Some said it was a sneaky thief. Others thought it was a big animal. Around that same time, there was a terrible drought, which didn't help the situation, and inflation was through the roof. The cost of goods had doubled, and what little made it to the town stores was rationed. To buy even a handful of beans and flour, we had to leave home early and stand in line in front of the stores. In town, there were only 2 places that sold meat, usually dried meat. Outside, there were rows of meat hanging up, and those who could buy would buy, while those who couldn't would just smell it. One of these meat shops was owned by a man nicknamed Cassava. In those hard times, his prices were the best, and unlike the other stores that were rationing, his shop was always stocked. Every Friday at 5 a.m., I'd take a horse and head to town to do the weekly shopping. Back then, we'd buy everything for the week, stopping at the store to get dry goods, and then heading to Cassava's butcher shop to buy a few pieces of dried meat before heading home. He was very well liked because he'd often give meat scraps to those who couldn't afford to buy any. They were smaller pieces, some even looking a bit rough, but for those with nothing, they were everything. When I'd go there, we'd chat a lot, and he'd always give me a few pieces of meat too. He'd say, "Ignacio, you know I have great respect for your family. If you ever don't have money to buy meat, don't hesitate to come here. I have plenty to share with you." Meanwhile, rumors about the animal attacks kept going around. One day, he gave me about 4 pounds of salted ribs. I got home, feeling happy, and my mother went to prepare the meat. When she opened the package, she was startled and said, "Ignacio, what kind of ribs are these? They're so thin. These bones don't even look like beef. They're too small." I looked at her and said, "I don't know, Mom. Cassava said they were just sitting in stock, and if I wanted to, I could take some. Geez, it's all meat, after all." My dad came up to the sink, looked over the ribs, and said, "Nah, must be from a little goat." My mom prepared the meat, but when it was time to eat, she said, "I'm not eating this meat. It has a strange smell and even foamed when I put it in the pot." I thought she was overreacting and ate almost all of it with my dad and brother. It tasted a bit different, but better than nothing. The next week, when I went back to town, there was a big stir. People had seen an unrecognizable creature going into the woods. Some residents gathered and started hunting the animal almost every night, saying it was as big as a strong man and covered in fur. I grabbed my groceries and went to see Mr. Cassava to pick up some meat. When I got there, I noticed that the usually full meat racks were empty. I asked, "Hey, Mr. Cassava, is the meat already sold out?" He looked angrier than I'd ever seen him, his face flushed with rage, and he replied gruffly, "Yep, Ignacio, things are tightening up. I'm not getting as much meat as before. If you don't want to go without, you'd better come early because what I do get runs out fast." With that, he didn't say another word, just took down the racks and locked the doors. I thought to myself, now it's really bad. Looks like I'll have to head to town at dawn if I want to buy a scrap of meat. The following week, I left at dawn, 4 a.m., just about to leave the house when my mom said, "Ignacio, it's way too dark. Wait a little while." But I replied, "Mom, if I go later, there won't even be a crumb of flour left when I get there. I'll go now while everyone's still sleeping so I can get in line." I hit the dirt road, a good 50-minute ride to town. It was a calm journey with a steady rhythm as I went through the big forest surrounding the town. The closer I got to the first neighborhoods, the more the forest began to clear out. A few yards away from leaving the road to enter the first neighborhood, my horse suddenly neighed loudly and reared up in fear, catching me off guard. I fell to the ground, and the horse turned and bolted back home. I tried to chase after it, but it lowered its ears and disappeared into the darkness. Frustrated and sore from the fall, I thought, "Great, you lousy horse. What spooked you? Now how am I supposed to get to town and then carry all the groceries back?" Standing there in the middle of the dark road, I suddenly heard the brush moving and heavy, raspy breathing. Something was coming out of the woods. Right then, I remembered the stories from the residents who said they'd seen a big animal. I dashed across the road and hid, and that's when I saw a huge, powerful shape emerge from the forest, dragging other animals by the legs. It looked around cautiously, trying not to make noise. My hands started sweating cold. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. I let it get a bit ahead, then crept along the edge of the woods, crouching as I followed it. It didn't look back. It was in a hurry, moving fast. At one point, I got a better look at it and felt terrified when I realized what it was: a werewolf. It was hunched forward, breathing heavily and low. I stood frozen because it's a sight that chills you to the bone. But what terrified me even more was when I looked at its hands. The animals it was dragging were already dead and didn't move. They were dogs and cats, with at least 10 in each hand, dragged by their tails or legs. I kept my distance because if it saw me, I knew it would attack. I saw exactly when that thing jumped over Mr. Casava's fence. I circled around the back street and snuck between the other houses until I reached the back wall. I carefully grabbed 2 bricks, climbed up quietly, and peeked over. The werewolf was standing there. Panting and growling, and scattered across the yard were piles of animals, one on top of the other. A pile of cats, a pile of dogs, and a pile of chickens. Man, I got out of there as fast as I could before it saw me. I ran all the way home. When I got home, I told my dad what I had seen. He was in disbelief and said, "My son, I can't believe this. Mr. Casava turns into a werewolf? So that's why there's never a shortage of meat at his shop. And worse, it's dog and cat meat. Who knows how many times we've eaten dog without knowing." I asked my dad, "Dad, what do we do now? Do we tell the town or do we keep quiet?" My dad replied, "Are you crazy, Ignacio? Just like we've eaten dog and cat meat, everyone else in town has too. If they find out, they'll go wild on him. I'll talk to him. Leave it to me." 2 days later, he went to see Mr. Casava, saying he knew his secret and advising him to leave town because people would catch on sooner or later. Mr. Casava thanked him for the warning and swore to keep it a secret. He promised to leave town, but my dad asked him one more question. "Why do you do this, man?" Mr. Casava replied, "Friend, I won't lie to you. When I turn into a werewolf, I lose control. Before, I used to go after people, but now I manage to control it better, so I only go after animals. And I had to do something with all that meat, right? I figured, well, if I season it right, it's not too bad, is it?" My dad nearly threw up when he heard that. By the end of the week, Mr. Casava was gone, and the animal disappearances stopped. You can't trust anyone, and the saying, "cheap comes at a high cost," never made more sense. Hello, everyone. I'm going to tell a terrifying story that my mother still tells me to this day. She says it all happened more than 50 years ago. She was around 11 years old when she overheard this conversation between her mother and her godmother in the town of Ribeirão Pernambuco. Her godmother was a well-known midwife and healer in the area. Many children in the town had her as their godmother. Her house was set far from the town, surrounded by many trees and medicinal plants, so hidden by vegetation that you could barely see the small house among all the plants. Her husband was an old man whom no one ever saw. She'd say he was very sick and troublesome when asked about him. Since my mother's family moved there, they often heard strange sounds, cries, moans, and howls in the dead of night. The townsfolk were wary, saying a werewolf lived in the woods, but no one had ever seen it. They only heard its cries, unlike any wolf they'd ever heard. Occasionally, someone would mention that a farm animal had been attacked, blaming it on the supposed werewolf. At that time, families were large, and babies were born every year. With so many births, it sometimes happened that a baby was stillborn, and this midwife took it upon herself to deal with the bodies, just as she took care of disposing of the placentas. But what nobody knew was that she was hiding a secret, which she confided to my grandmother after her husband had passed. My mother was in the outhouse beside the house and overheard the entire conversation. The midwife told my grandmother that she was relieved the old man had died. She had endured everything because her parents had forced her to marry him when she was young, in exchange for a piece of land and 2 donkeys. He took her far from her family to Ribeirão, and as time passed, she discovered she had married a cursed man. She learned that her husband turned into a werewolf. When she gave birth to her first child, he prevented a midwife from assisting. He handled the birth himself, and she never saw that baby again. One night, she caught him in their backyard, transformed and devouring an animal. He threatened her, saying that if she ever told anyone his secret, she would meet the same fate. After that discovery, he taught her the skills of a midwife and forced her to bring him the remains from births, including the placentas for him to eat, even the stillborn fetuses. He said that was the only way he could resist attacking the village children. She was coerced into these horrors to keep the town's children safe. Over the years, he grew sicker, likely from consuming such things. His bed reeked of rot, he vomited and passed blood. In disbelief, my grandmother asked why she never ran away. Through sobs, the midwife replied, "Friend, werewolves are expert hunters. They don't leave alive anyone who discovers their secret." This story comes from my mother, who recounts it with a serious expression and admits the profound fear she felt hearing it. Good evening. I'm from a rural area in Sergipe, and I've already sent a few stories to your channel. Today, I'm sharing another experience that still gives me chills. For privacy reasons, I won't identify myself, and I'll change the name of the friend who experienced this story, as he is very private. This incident took place around the year 2000. My friend, whom I'll call Joseph, used to help his father herd sheep. Every morning, he would take the animals out to a pasture about 1 kilometer from the village, and at the end of the day, he'd bring the sheep back home. During Lent, people would often warn him, "Get back early, or you'll meet the werewolf." But Joseph didn't believe in those stories. After all, no one had heard about werewolves in the area for a long time. On one of those evenings, Joseph was heading home around 6:30 as usual. He'd finished his work with the sheep and was thinking of nothing more than getting home and resting. As he started up a part of the road that was darker and surrounded by brush, he saw a huge dog standing at the roadside. Joseph watched the creature, unsure what to do. He hesitated, but without much choice, decided to keep moving forward. That's when he realized it wasn't an ordinary dog, but a werewolf. Fear overtook him in a way he'd never felt before. He froze for a few seconds, then quickly decided to back away, stepping into the pasture to avoid an encounter with the creature. But the werewolf leapt over the fence with ease, as if determined to follow him. Joseph returned to the road, but the beast continued to pursue him. Panicking, Joseph began to run toward the village, with the werewolf right behind him, getting closer and closer. He tried to escape by jumping fences and cutting through shortcuts, but the creature wouldn't give up. Only when he saw the village lights in the distance did the werewolf start to slow down. Even then, Joseph didn't stop running until he reached the main street, breathless, voiceless, and with his heart pounding so hard he nearly fainted. The people there ran to help him. Once he finally recovered and managed to explain what had happened, Some believed him, while others laughed, thinking he was making it up. But I assure you, he told me this story, swearing it was true, and he never returned to the pasture at night. He stayed scared for a long time after what he saw. This is my story. Believe it or not, the supernatural is out there, and those who doubt it may find themselves facing their greatest fear. Thank you.